On today's show,
just two little boys on an adventure, and sadly one didn't return.
this podcast is recommended for listeners over the age of 18 years. It contains content that some may find distressing, including but not limited to themes of death, abuse, violence, murder, self-harm and missing persons.
Welcome to What Are We Looking At, a podcast about the true crime cases of retired Detective Valentine Smith. I'm Private Investigator Samantha. Like and subscribe to our channel for exclusive content. Today's episode is about two separate little boys who went missing in the Victorian wilderness several decades ago. So Val, tell us about these two little boys.
There's something about waterfalls that attracts us all. But sadly, sometimes that attraction can be fatal. And amongst the many missing person cases that I've examined, both here and in the United States, there are a few that involve waterfalls. And this next case is one of them. Now, it's about a little boy called Kostya Medzinsev.
Mm-hmm.
Now, Kostya was a 5.5-year-old Belarusian boy who disappeared in August 1972. It's over 50 years ago. It's a very important case. Now, Kostya and his family and a large gathering of friends were on a picnic at Taronga Falls near Newgee in the eastern and Victorian bush, which is about 120 kilometres and a 2-hour drive east of Melbourne in mountain range country.
Mm.
Taking time out from a busy life of working hard, settling into life in their new Australian environment, just to enjoy a day out in the peaceful open air of the Australian bush. Our bush, like our beaches and our rivers, present as beautiful, wonderful places. However, there is always a quiet, hidden danger for those that aren't accustomed to the deadly risks beneath that veil of beauty. We see it all the time. Now, looking at the backstory, there's a whole interesting insight into the family. They originally fled Stalin-era Russia to settle into China, and after many years of Chinese residency, the communist government reviewed all non-Chinese citizens, delivered an ultimatum. You can become Chinese or go back to Russia.
Mm-hmm.
Unlike many non-Chinese, the ultimatum was perhaps more about a choice between freedom or the uncertainties of life under communist rule.
Mm.
So consequently, the Medzinsevs became refugees and eventually came to Australia. Now, this picnic day was meant to be special, but instead it turned out to be a lifetime of open-ended grief and loss for the family, as Kostya, the little 5-year-old son of Mr. and Mrs. Medzinsev, stepped out onto a walking track near the campsite. Now, Kostya took off for a short walk with his brother Robert, just two little boys on an adventure, and sadly, one didn't return. It was 1:30 in the afternoon when little Kostya was last seen. It was not known which way he went. He was gone. Now, by first light on Monday, the 28th of August, which is the next day, the search for Kostya was already showing signs of gearing up into the biggest search at that time in Victorian state history. Eventually, over 300 searches taking place in a search that would last over 2 weeks.
Mm.
The Amalgamated or Federation of Victorian Walking Clubs began arriving at the Russell Street Police Headquarters in the city at 6:15 a.m. to print off the maps and move out on buses to Taronga.
Mm.
So the groups, once they got to Taronga, they moved out to designated search areas along the spurs and from high ground, whilst others searched along the Taronga and the Little Taronga rivers. Now, at 3 p.m. that first day, a walking club party returned to the base camp with Kostya's jumper, which they had located on the search. It's a significant find.
Mm.
Whilst leaving the main group of searchers to search the area where it was located, unfortunately with no further result.
Mm.
Now, as far as the weather was concerned, it remained pretty good on the Monday, which has allowed the searchers to continue searching well into the night, in fact, right up until midnight. However, the second day, Tuesday the 29th of August, it rained heavy all day. On a number of occasions, more footprints were sighted, but unfortunately, under further examination, were eliminated.
Mm.
Now, you've got to understand the terrain in this country. It was rough, and searchers were rapidly becoming exhausted and somewhat despondent, although they were determined, because a number of them were injured, and at least on one occasion, 3 searchers actually became lost overnight on the Wednesday night, having to stay the night in the bush until rescue the next morning. And by day 4, on Thursday, the 31st of August, the medical assessment as to the survivability of poor little Kostya was, in the opinion of 3 doctors, remote. However, the search would continue another 9 days. Now, the impact on searchers and their recollection is best left as they remember it. So, without trying to rephrase or edit another's thoughts, the following are the exact comments of a searcher as told to me in 2019. That is some 47 years after Kostya disappeared in 1972.
Wow.
So these are the exact words as told to me after all those years.
Mm-hmm.
What still haunts me, if you can picture 30-plus men so tired, sitting in a clearing having lunch and saying nothing. We could hear Kostya's father's desperate shouts from the valley below, and I can still hear him in my mind. I think, in my opinion, the search was exhausted by those involved seen through a foot soldier's eyes. Some years later, I contacted Warrigal CIB to see if his remains were ever found, and they had no record of the missing person, which was disappointing.
Mm-hmm.
I personally felt Kostya fell into the river, by which the path ran alongside, and was sucked under the many rounded large rocks I remembered, and drowned in the river. Given its force, it would be quick and impossible to confirm due to the heavy traffic on the path used by the searchers. The footprint was real. Alongside was a dog's footprint. May have been a hunter with a dog pre-gun control. The other theory is a wild dog got him in a weakened state. Both speculation. I personally think the river scenario to be the most likely. As I said, it still haunts me. We really tried. It talks about the wild dog theory. I mean, there are wild dogs all through the Victorian bush. Recent genetic testing reveals that these dogs are more closely linked to ancestral dingoes than previously thought.
Mm.
The lack of records is not surprising, as Australian missing person records are not at a level of absolute accuracy to where I could say with confidence that in 2025, every known missing person case is readily recorded and accessible. The description that he gives of the river is accurate. The Tarongo and the Little Tarongo rivers are littered with large boulders, which form tunnels into which the river thunders and disappears. I've been there. I've had a look at it. I've studied that area. Some areas is up to 150 metres. So the searchers' theory on Kostya falling into the river was one shared by many of the searchers, including the lead police search and rescue coordinator, who was also interviewed by me regarding this case. So in March 2017, I attended a nursing home in Melbourne's outer eastern suburbs where I interviewed 85-year-old Bill Brand. Now, in 1972, as a 45-year-old sergeant with the Victoria Police Search and Rescue Squad, Bill was the coordinator of and in charge of the search for Kostya at Taronga Falls.
Mm-hmm.
Now, the interview with Bill was one of the most uplifting connections I've made in investigating missing person cases.
Mm.
So whilst Bill's recollection of some things was excusably a little hazy due to his age, it was not without the detailed essence and substance that was needed to get a feel and understanding of the condition and likelihood of what could have happened to poor little Kostya.
Mm.
But we talked about the Taronga River disappearing under the rocks, and his exact words were, and I quote, "Kids' footprints in the edge, in the sand, on the creek in one location. They could have been either of the boys, we weren't sure. That was upstream from where it disappeared amongst the rocks. It didn't come back out, I think. It will still be the same situation today, I believe. It will be worth looking at." So he's saying the same thing, that the footprints were on the edge in the sand above where the water disappeared under the rocks. Bill could not remember the names of the tracks in the Taronga River area, However, in relation to the weather conditions, he could remember that hypothermia was mentioned. So we're talking about a distinctive drop in the temperature when hypothermia kicks in, which reduces the survivability of anyone that's lost out there. Bill said that the Taronga Falls area was used as a search and rescue training area for a long time, with the thought that if the area was continued to be visited in search for training, then they might, as a bonus, find something. Towards the end of our conversation, I raised an earlier case of a little boy named Gregory Trent, who had also been lost at Taronga Falls in 1967, but luckily had survived after spending 2 days and a freezing night alone in the bush.
Wow. We
discussed the case for a while until it was time for Bill to go to lunch. It was Friday. Fish and chips were on the menu, and Bill was not about to miss out on a feed of fish and chips for anyone. As I said goodbye to Bill whilst walking to the dining room, he must have been pondering on an earlier comment I'd made re Gregory Trent walking 5 kilometres from Taronga Falls when lost in 1967. He stopped for a second, turned, and he said, "Well, a kid that age can walk that distance in an hour." So to understand more about lost child behaviour in the bush, it is important that as an investigator, you examine similar cases to gain similar fact, information and intelligence. And in my early days of investigating just one case of a missing 10-year-old boy in the Victorian bush, I studied over 80 similar cases.
Wow.
Yeah, Kostya's case was one of them. And so too was the case of Gregory Trent. Now, Gregory Trent was lost at Taronga Falls in similar circumstances as Kostya. So there are elements of his case that provided valuable material for consideration in relation to Kostya's case.
Can you tell us about the similarities or the commonalities between this case and the Gregory Trent case? How does one case help the other?
Well, the next case, which is in many ways one of the most important of all of the, we'll call them the lost boys cases, because it was a whole group of cases I was looking at. Why? Because it is not that of a little boy lost forever, but instead one of a little boy found safe and alive.
Wow.
And it's one thing that I'm very, very strong on is that we should be doing a lot more interviews of persons that are found and getting the detail of their experience.
Absolutely.
So we can learn from that.
Yeah.
This was Gregory Trent, who was lost in 1967. However, it is directly relevant to the previous case of Kostya NimmihssiK because Gregory Trent was lost at Taronga Falls in similar conditions to Kostya, but unlike Kostya, was lucky to have been found. Of even greater significance to similar cases is that Gregory is now a man in his 60s who has lived a full life.
Amazing.
He's now a registered nurse. He lives in Melbourne, Victoria. In 1967, when he was lost in the bush, he was 9 years old, which is similar to many of the cases of pre-adolescent boys I've examined. Now, in essence, Gregory's life story is theirs, the one that they never had. Like to say he's their ambassador. But only he is here to tell the story of a little boy's long life alone in the wilderness. The following is mostly from his words and taken from 2 interviews that I had with Gregory in 2016. But first, let us understand who Gregory is and who he was back in 1967. He resided in Rye, Victoria, described himself as a fairly quiet student. His hobbies at the time included fishing, swimming and mushrooming. And as we continued in the discussion in the interviews with him, he drifted back to when he was rescued at Taronga and how happy he was on that day he was found to see his dad. So it was Saturday, July the 16th, 1967, Taronga Falls, New G. Same place, only 3 or 4 weeks difference, the time of the year to the Kostya NimmihssiK case. The Trent family had travelled to Taronga Falls with 2 other families for a picnic. Same scenario. They had arrived at about 10 a.m. and went for a walk up to the falls, and Gregory kept nagging his parents for food. The plan was to go to the falls, walk back down, and then come back to the camp area and have some lunch. He said that the whole walk was to have taken no more than an hour. And whilst walking on the track back towards the picnic ground, he had pestered his parents into allowing him to run on ahead. They were walking at an average pace. Gregory said that he was not paying attention to anything other than the trees and the water and the foliage. He said that he was starving hungry. That is why he was nagging his parents to return to the campsite. He wanted something to eat. For Gregory, it was some time before he realised that sometime earlier, when he had come to a fork somewhere in the track, he had taken the wrong direction. Now, initially, he wasn't too concerned, as he believed that he'd be able to walk out. However, he became distressed after a while when he just kept walking into the bush. And at one time, he said he came upon a leaking, rusty water pipe, and he followed it for some time as he thought that it would eventually lead to a house. However, it ultimately led nowhere. Clothing always plays an important part in survivability. And for Greg, it was most relevant. His clothing at the time was typical of what would be expected of a lad to be wearing on a family picnic in Victoria's winter, which consisted of thin corduroy long pants, leather shoes, a hand-knitted, probably woolen jumper, a beanie, and a thin jacket, which he described as not really waterproof. It drizzled a bit during the night, and the rain and drizzle made his clothing wet. He first realised that he was lost when he was walking for about 10 or 20 minutes after he'd taken the wrong fork. It was about midday, and he recalled that the weather was cool but not raining. However, it was probably a bit windy. Gregory said that when he realised he was lost, he waited around and called out for a while. And then he decided that if he kept walking, he would walk out. He had no idea of the vastness of the bush and wilderness. He had walked a few kilometres. Overnight on the 16th of July, he lay down to sleep on a bed of ferns and covered himself with his jacket. Gregory's panic-stricken family waited in anxious anticipation, hoping that every small group of searchers returning home from a thick, damp, dripping bush would be carrying a little boy. All that is except Gregory's dad, Joe, who had not paused for 1 minute, who was spending every second searching, watching, calling, listening, worrying. And her father's sort of worrying for everything, which included reports that there were wild dogs in the area. This is a man in his 60s, recalling in detail his feelings and senses and other experiences as a little boy alone in the bush, which from an investigative perspective is invaluable in understanding the first-hand influences that impact survivability on those in similar circumstances. He said he lost his confidence that he would walk out. Once he realised that he was lost and stuck in the bush, his thoughts turned to water and shelter. So he's 9 years old. He's older than Kostya by 4 years. His plan was to keep walking. He was pretty hungry and tired. He said that he did not drink much. He found a house 3/4-inch gal-style water pipe coming out of the bush and he had a drink out of that. There was no house or anything near it. He walked most of the second day. I was going to walk out. When you're 9, you don't realise how big an area you were in. He thought about rubbing sticks together to start a fire, but a thought was all it was. He said matches would have been good. He said that he walked for all the daylight hours with rests in between. This was from midday on the 16th to 4 p.m. on the 17th. He recalled sleeping in the bracken fern because it was thick and deep. His thirst could have easily been sorted out had he been on the rivers. And this is his quote: "If I had followed the water, I probably would not have got lost. The water was quite turbulent, so I kept away from the water." So that's interesting. He actually recognised the danger of those rivers and stayed away from them. Now, he was found by searchers at 4 p.m. on Sunday, the 16th of July. By the time he was taken out, it was dark. He was found behind some big boulders. He said, "I was sort of behind them, and I could hear rustling in the trees. I could hear, 'Greg, Greg,' and I yelled out, 'I'm over here behind the rock.'" He described the rocks as massive big boulders. He was just walking around. The searchers were quite amazed they had walked so far. The sad thing about this case is that just as the curtain closed on this story and celebrations were about to be held thanking everyone for their efforts in the search for Gregory, tragedy would strike its devil blow. That Joseph Trent, Gregory's father, 54 years of age, would die suddenly of a heart attack on the 30th of July, 1967, just 2 weeks following Gregory's rescue and 3 days before the planned thank you function for rescuers. And after all these years, Gregory has some simple, perhaps obvious advice. However, it comes from the experience of a young victim who, unlike many others, survived. In a contemporary sense, he said, if you're going to take your children into the bush as parents, you need to keep a close eye on them. He also said that at no time was he asked similar questions to what I was asking. No one had so asked him any psychological questions or gave him or his family any debriefing. He thought that a debriefing at the time could have helped. But it's interesting, just like the professional searchers in the NimmihssiK case, that Gregory highlighted the turbulence in the river, which he described as thunderous. And he was afraid of it to such an extent that he would rather endure thirst, risk going near it to get a drink of water, which speaks volumes of how a 9-year-old calculates his own capacity of dealing with risk, which might differ considerably from that of a 5-year-old.
Absolutely. And different compared to an adult or a teen as well. An incredibly heartbreaking story from a parent's point of view. I've got children myself, and I just can't even imagine how dreadful that would be, going on pleasant family outing and then for that to have occurred, and in such an innocent way too. The parents in this particular situation don't sound like they were doing the wrong thing or that they should be held accountable. Gregory was just being a young boy. But the interesting thing that comes from this is, as you said in the beginning, that it really does give us insider information about the differences between adult and children missing persons behaviour, and their logic and the way that they structure their plan of how to be found or to get back out. The fact that he kept walking in a forward direction, thinking that at some point he would just pop back out of the bush, is a fascinating sort of idea. And from a 9-year-old's point of view, I guess that does actually make sense. But it makes you wonder, if he were a teen, would he have thought to have just turned around and gone back the track that he had already come from, or follow the water system as well, knowing that that would end up leading somewhere?
It's hard to say, Sam. I've been on a number of searches. I remember one, I think he was about a 3-year-old, and we found him, and he was about 3.5 kilometres away from where he went missing, in mountain country, uphill. And he'd gone on a track, and he just basically walked as far as he could until he got tired and just lay down and went to sleep. The key in that case, as in most cases, is time. The quicker you can get there and put your containment lines in to contain them within a search area, because they can walk a long way in a short period of time.
Absolutely.
And that's the risk. If you don't get those containment lines in to some extent, they can walk out of the search area before you even get there. And the other thing they can also do too is actually walk back into an area that's already been searched. And I've seen that happen.
So can you tell us a little bit more about who determines the containment lines? What's the process in that?
It differs from area to area. I mean, you rely on experience, and certainly if you've got search and rescue professionals there, you rely on their experience to make the call on that. But it's dependent upon the terrain itself, and natural features and those sort of things, and the subject person that's missing.
To the extent of the containment lines, do they have a particular distance according to the age of the person that went missing, or how does that get determined?
You've got natural features which they couldn't walk through, like a cliff face would block in one direction. But there's a formula which is called the Naismith formula, which determines how far a person can walk within a given time. That takes into consideration the time and the elevation.
Yeah.
Obviously, you've got to consider the level of fitness of the person that's missing.
Absolutely. And I assume that you would take into consideration the weather as well and other environmental factors.
Yeah.
And so what can Gregory's story tell us about Costa's story? What were the differences? Why do you think that Gregory was found alive and Costa was not? Is there something that is a really obvious reason?
There's a couple of things working in Gregory's favour. I think one of them is his age, 4 years older, certainly to his benefit. And the second thing is he stayed away from the river of his own accord. We don't know whether Costa did. That's certainly a factor. Luck plays a big part in these things. You imagine little Costa, a little boy of 5 and a half, in thick bush, he can easily get missed. And that's the tragedy of it. Brief a child beforehand. If you get lost, stay on a track. I mean, that's the key. Stay out of the bush. Sometimes there's not much difference between a walking track and a kangaroo run through the bush, and they go off the track and follow the game trail. And that's it.
So, Val, how do you think that the family move forward after these kinds of things happen? Obviously, it's different slightly if the child is found, but there's still the trauma that's attached to the experience, not just for the individual that went missing, but also for the family that had to try and find that child. How do you think they feel about that ongoing?
For the families of the missing, I don't think they ever move forward, really. The hurt, the loss goes on forever. I can't say I know what they feel because I've never experienced it, but I understand a lot more than a lot of people because I've spoken to a lot of families. The loss that they experience stays with them forever. The anxiety and the stress goes beyond the families. The searchers carry that loss too. With the families, they'll never know. They can't grieve because they have nothing to grieve. There's no end, no certainty. There is no closure. There's no grave. There's no conclusion. Just a continuous loss.
We refer to that as ambiguous loss. Dr. Sarah Wayland is the specialist in Australia that discusses that concept. And it's terrible. I feel for anyone who is found in that position. I'm just grateful that we have organisations like the Mist Foundation where people of lived experience can support others.
Absolutely. I just hope that the community and government and agencies take just a little bit of time to stop and think about the families and the missing and the people that dedicate their time in this work. That's all I ask.
If you or someone you know has found this content distressing and needs support, please contact Lifeline, Beyond Blue, or the Suicide Callback Service. For more information about who we are and what we do, please visit www.missingинaustralia.com.au. Till next time.